This is one of our prime examples of lost ancient technology. This was not a bunch of Egyptian slaves hacking out a giant monument for the pharaohs. This predates the pharaohs, and that is what we're trying to figure out.
For thousands of years, strange marks carved into giant granite stones in Egypt have puzzled historians, engineers, and archaeologists.
These are dolerite pounders. These are hard stone balls that would have been theoretically used to shape it, but the material is too hard for that to be an explanation. And it's very fortunate that it's unfinished because it allows us to see the process in action.
According to history, these stones were shaped using simple tools, hard stone hammers, and years of human labor. But what if the story is not that simple? Recently, Grok AI analyzed detailed scans from Egypt's famous Aswan Quarry and revealed patterns that some believe look surprisingly similar to marks made by modern machines. From a massive unfinished obelisk to mysterious cuts hidden deep inside the quarry, the evidence raises new questions. Were the ancient Egyptians far more advanced than we thought? Or are we missing a crucial piece of history? Join us as we investigate one of Egypt's most fascinating mysteries, the monument that was never finished. In the city of Aswan, in southern Egypt, there is a piece of stone so large that it is hard to fully picture, carved directly into the bedrock of the earth, longer than 2 basketball courts placed end to end, heavier than 1,000 tons, and it has never moved from the spot where ancient workers first began cutting it thousands of years ago. This is the unfinished obelisk, and it is one of the more interesting puzzles the ancient world has left behind. An obelisk is a tall, narrow tower of stone that tapers to a pointed top, and the ancient Egyptians built them to honor their gods and pharaohs, raising them in front of temples as symbols of power and devotion, carving them from granite, and sometimes transporting them hundreds of miles along the Nile to their final locations. This one never made that journey. If it had been completed and raised upright, it would have been the largest obelisk ever built in ancient Egypt, standing taller than a 12-story building, larger than any other monument of its kind, a remarkable piece of engineering by any standard. Instead, it lies on its side, still partially attached to the bedrock, exactly where workers left it, with no clear record of why the project ended or what happened to the people working on it. The cracks that stopped construction are still visible today, running along the stone in long, uneven lines, and the tool marks left by ancient hands remain pressed into the surface with surprising clarity, giving researchers something concrete to study even after thousands of years. Why did work stop? What tools did they use to cut something this large from stone, this hard? And does the evidence in the quarry actually match the explanations that have been offered? Those questions have stayed with this site for a long time, and some of the answers that have come back, including from an unexpected source in the form of artificial intelligence, have added new layers to a conversation that was already complicated. To understand what researchers found, it helps to first understand the material the ancient Egyptians were working with, because granite is not an easy stone, and the difficulty of cutting it shapes everything else in this story. A stone harder than the story suggests. Granite is one of the harder natural materials found on Earth, formed deep underground, where intense pressure and heat fused minerals together over very long periods of time into a dense, tough rock that resists cutting, chipping, and wearing down far more than most other stones. It sits near the top of the hardness scale for natural materials, harder than marble, sandstone, and limestone, the stone used in many other ancient structures, and working with it today, even with modern equipment including diamond-tipped drill bits, water jets, and precision cutting machines, is considered skilled and time-consuming work. Stonemasons who visit the Aswan Quarry often remark on the scale of what was attempted there, not because it is impossible to understand practically, but because the volume of work involved in cutting a block this size from granite, under any conditions, represents an enormous sustained effort. What the ancient Egyptians left behind in the quarry, beyond the unfinished obelisk itself, are marks cut into the granite surface, long curved grooves running in consistent arcs, appearing repeatedly across the quarry floor, along the sides of the obelisk, and inside narrow channels where working space is very limited. The consistency of these marks is what researchers keep returning to, because similar patterns appear in open areas and in tight spaces alike, in locations where swinging a heavy hammerstone freely would have been difficult, and in places where the working conditions would have been cramped and awkward by any reasonable measure. That consistency raised a straightforward question. Were the tools being described in the standard explanation actually the ones producing these particular marks? And if not, what else might account for them? Researchers began looking more carefully at the evidence, and the closer they looked, the more the quarry seemed to be holding something back. The mainstream explanation for how this cutting was done has been widely accepted for decades, and it is worth understanding clearly before examining where the questions begin. The official explanation. The mainstream explanation for how ancient Egyptians cut granite has been in place for a long time, and it is built on physical evidence found at the quarry itself, which gives it a reasonable foundation that most researchers have been comfortable accepting. The basic idea is this. Workers used balls of diorite, a stone harder than granite, to pound the surface repeatedly until the rock broke down and could be removed in small pieces. These diorite hammerstones, some of which have been found at Aswan and other quarry sites across Egypt, are roughly the size of a large grapefruit, heavy enough to do real damage to granite when swung with force, and hard enough to survive repeated impact without breaking apart quickly. The process, as archaeologists describe it, would have been slow and physically demanding. Large groups of workers, possibly numbering in the hundreds or even thousands at a busy quarry, would have taken turns pounding the stone in long sessions, gradually deepening the cuts around the obelisk until it was separated on three sides, at which point it would have been levered away from the bedrock below and moved toward the Nile. Supporting this theory is the fact that diorite balls have been recovered from Egyptian quarry sites in considerable numbers, that the general shape of the cuts around the unfinished obelisk is consistent with pounding rather than slicing, and that ancient Egyptian texts and wall paintings show large organized labor forces carrying out construction work on a scale that makes a manpower-heavy approach entirely plausible. There is also a practical logic to the explanation. The Egyptians had access to large numbers of workers. They had time, they had organizational ability, and they had diorite, which is genuinely capable of cutting granite when used with enough persistence. None of this is unreasonable. This explanation became the accepted view in archaeology and has been repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits for generations, partly because the physical evidence supports it at a general level, and partly because no compelling alternative had been clearly demonstrated. But acceptance is not the same as completeness, and when researchers and craftspeople began trying to replicate the marks using the methods described, something did not quite line up. The results of those replication attempts opened a gap between the theory and the evidence that proved harder to close than expected. Can modern workers recreate it? One of the more useful ways to test an archaeological theory is to try it in practice, to take the tools being proposed, use them in the way the theory describes, and compare what you produce against what survives in the original site. This is called experimental archaeology, and researchers have applied it to the granite quarrying question more than once. The experiments generally confirmed part of the mainstream theory. Diorite hammerstones do work on granite. When struck against the surface with reasonable force, they create visible damage, removing small fragments and gradually wearing the stone down. Skilled experimenters were able to produce pits and shallow depressions that resembled, in a general sense, some of the marks visible at Aswan. That part of the story held up. Where the experiments became less straightforward was in the detail. The marks produced by hammerstone pounding tend to be irregular, slightly uneven in depth, and inconsistent in their spacing, which makes sense given that a person swinging a heavy stone by hand will naturally vary their angle, force, and position from one strike to the next, even when trying to be precise. The marks in the Aswan Quarry, however, show a level of regularity that several researchers found difficult to reproduce through pounding alone. The curved grooves in particular, which run in long, smooth arcs across the granite, did not appear naturally in the experimental results at a comparable scale or consistency. Some stonemasons who examined the original marks noted that the profile of certain grooves, the way the cut deepens and curves and maintains an even width along its length, looked more consistent with a rotational cutting action than with repeated percussion. This observation was not universal, and other experts disagreed, but it was enough to keep the question open. The honest conclusion from the replication attempts was that diorite hammerstones could produce results broadly similar to what is seen at Aswan, but not identical, and that the specific characteristics of the long curved grooves remained difficult to fully explain through pounding alone. That left researchers with a choice between concluding that the experiments were simply imperfect reproductions of a genuine hammerstone technique, or that something additional was involved in producing at least some of the marks. The answer, some believed, might be hiding in patterns that had not yet been properly measured. The marks hidden beneath the surface. When researchers moved beyond the most accessible and well-photographed parts of the Aswan Quarry and began documenting marks in harder-to-reach locations, what they found was consistent in a way that added weight to the questions already being raised. The same curved groove patterns that appear on the broad open surfaces of the quarry also appear on vertical walls deep inside narrow cutting channels, in corners where working space is tight, and on surfaces positioned at angles that would have made swinging a hammerstone freely quite difficult. In some of these locations, a person can barely stand upright, let alone build up the kind of force and momentum that effective pounding would require. Yet the marks are there, and they look the same. This spatial consistency is one of the details that researchers have found hardest to account for within the standard explanation. If the grooves were produced by workers pounding with handheld stones, you would reasonably expect the marks in confined spaces to look different from those in open areas, perhaps shallower, less regular, or showing signs of awkward angles and interrupted strokes. Instead, the pattern holds. Careful documentation also revealed something else. The spacing between parallel groove lines in many parts of the quarry is remarkably even, and the arc of each groove follows a curve that repeats at a similar radius across different sections of the site. This kind of repetition is not impossible to achieve by hand, but it requires either an unusual degree of control or the use of some kind of guide or template to maintain consistency. A few researchers began suggesting that whatever tool or method produced these marks, it was operating in a way that was largely independent of the space around it, meaning the working mechanism itself was compact enough and self-contained enough to function in tight areas just as effectively as in open ones, producing the same result regardless of the surrounding conditions. That is a specific kind of behavior, and when the characteristics of the grooves were compiled into a detailed data set, including depth, width, curvature, spacing, and surface texture, researchers found themselves with something precise enough to submit to a more systematic form of analysis. That analysis would come from a source that had not previously been part of archaeological research at Aswan, and the patterns it identified would shift the conversation in a direction few had anticipated. When artificial intelligence entered the investigation. At some point in any investigation, the tools available to researchers matter as much as the questions being asked. And when the questions around the Aswan Quarry marks reached a level of detail that human measurement alone was struggling to resolve, a different kind of tool entered the picture. High-resolution scanning equipment was brought to the quarry to capture the surface marks in precise digital detail, producing three-dimensional records of grooves, channels, and cut faces that could be studied away from the site itself, rotated, measured, and compared without the limits of physical access. These scans captured information that the human eye, even a trained one, tends to miss or average out when looking at a surface directly. The data collected included hundreds of individual measurements across the quarry, covering groove depth at multiple points along each arc, the width of cuts from edge to edge, the radius of the curves, the spacing between parallel lines, and the texture of the cut surface itself. The tiny ridges and scratches left behind at the bottom of each groove that can indicate how the cutting action moved through the stone. This dataset was submitted to Grok AI for analysis. Grok is a large artificial intelligence system, and what it is good at is finding patterns inside large sets of numbers, spotting similarities and regularities that are hard to see when you are looking at the data point by point. It does not get tired, it does not make assumptions based on what it expects to find, and it can compare an incoming dataset against a very large library of reference information quickly and without bias. The AI was given the quarry measurements and asked to look for patterns in the data, to describe what the cutting behavior looked like in mathematical terms, and to identify anything in its reference library that produced a similar signature. It worked through the data methodically, mapping the geometry of the grooves, the consistency of the arc radii, the surface texture patterns, and the relationship between cut depth and cut width across different parts of the quarry. What it returned was not a simple answer. It was a set of observations about the data that raised new questions as much as it resolved old ones, and the pattern it identified pointed in a direction that surprised the researchers looking at the results. What the AI found when it compared the quarry marks against thousands of known tool profiles was not what most people were expecting. A surprising match. When Grok AI finished working through the Aswan Quarry data, it produced a comparison report, and the results were interesting enough that researchers spent considerable time deciding what to make of them. The AI had compared the groove measurements against a large reference library covering a wide range of cutting tools and methods, both ancient and modern, looking for the closest match to the pattern of depth, curvature, spacing, and surface texture found in the quarry marks. Diorite hammerstone pounding appeared in the results, but it was not the strongest match. The closest matches the AI identified came from rotary cutting systems, tools that work by spinning a cutting surface against the material being worked, rather than striking it repeatedly. In modern terms, this category includes things like core drills, rotary saws, and disc cutters, tools that produce smooth, consistent arcs, because the geometry of the cut is controlled by the rotation itself, rather than by the steadiness of a human hand. The groove profiles from Aswan, in terms of their mathematical shape, their surface texture, and the consistency of their arc radius, matched this category more closely than they matched percussion-based cutting. Researchers were careful about what this meant. A match in profile does not prove that identical technology was used. It means the marks shared geometric characteristics, and there are different ways that similar geometry can be produced. Ancient workers with a very high level of skill and a well-designed manual tool could, in principle, produce marks that look mathematically similar to those made by a powered rotary system. What the AI result did was sharpen the question rather than answer it. If the marks look like rotary cutting, then either the ancient Egyptians had access to some form of rotary tool, which would be a significant finding, or they had a manual method precise enough to produce the same geometric result, which would itself be remarkable. Neither option is simple, and neither can be confirmed from the data alone. What the comparison did rule out, at least for the specific grooves in question, was a clean and easy fit with basic hammerstone pounding, which had been the default explanation for a long time. But the most difficult part of the puzzle was not in the open areas of the quarry where measurements were easy to take. It was somewhere much harder to reach. The shafts. Nobody can easily explain. Some of the most important evidence at the Aswan Quarry is also the hardest to get to, found in narrow vertical shafts and deep channels cut directly into the granite, in places where the working space is so limited that a person has to turn sideways just to fit inside. These shafts were cut to separate the obelisk from the surrounding rock, creating the clearance needed to eventually lift and move it. And some of them go down several meters into the ground, with walls that close in on both sides and very little room to do anything more than stand still. Inside these shafts, the same groove patterns appear, the same arc shapes, the same consistent spacing, the same smooth curve profiles that show up on the wide open surfaces of the quarry are also pressed into the walls of these narrow cuts. In locations where raising a heavy hammerstone above shoulder height and bringing it down with real force would be genuinely awkward, and where building up any kind of swinging rhythm would be difficult. Engineers who have studied the shafts point out that effective percussion cutting relies on momentum, on the ability to swing a tool through a useful arc before it contacts the stone, and that this becomes much harder to achieve when the walls are close enough to touch on both sides. Yet the marks show no sign of this difficulty. They do not get shallower near the bottom of the shafts where access would have been hardest. They do not show the irregular, interrupted pattern you might expect from a worker struggling with limited space. They look the same as the marks everywhere else. This is the part of the site that engineers find hardest to set aside. It is one thing to argue about groove profiles on open surfaces where many techniques could theoretically apply. It is harder to explain how the same precise, consistent marks appear at the bottom of a narrow shaft several meters underground. One possibility is that the cutting tool being used was small and compact enough to operate effectively in a confined space, requiring very little room to function, and producing the same result whether the worker was standing in open air or pressed against a narrow wall. That possibility connects directly to an older question about whether some ancient knowledge of stone cutting has simply been lost over time. The lost knowledge possibility. There is a version of this story that does not require advanced machines or forgotten technology, and it is worth taking seriously because it rests on something that is genuinely true about ancient craftspeople and the way skilled knowledge is passed down through generations. The people who worked the Aswan Quarry did not start from nothing. They inherited techniques from workers who came before them, refined those techniques over lifetimes of practice, and passed what they learned to the next generation in an unbroken chain that stretched across centuries. What accumulated in that chain was not just method, it was judgment, the ability to read a stone surface, feel how a tool was behaving, and make small adjustments that no written instruction could fully capture. This kind of knowledge is sometimes called tacit knowledge, and it is the reason a skilled craftsperson can do things that look almost impossible to someone watching from the outside. It lives in the hands and the eyes and the body more than in the mind, and it does not survive easily when the chain breaks. The chain at Aswan broke. Whatever tradition of quarry work produced the unfinished obelisk eventually ended, and when it ended, the detailed practical knowledge that made those precise, consistent marks possible may have gone with it, leaving only the marks themselves and no clear record of how they were made. Some researchers believe this is enough to explain what the AI found. A highly skilled worker using a well-designed manual tool shaped from diorite or another hard stone and guided by decades of learned instinct might produce groove profiles that look mathematically similar to rotary cutting simply because they had found, through long practice, the most efficient way to move a cutting edge through granite. Efficiency in cutting tends to produce smooth arcs regardless of the tool, because smooth arcs reduce resistance and waste less effort. The stone reading theory, as some have called it, suggests that experienced quarry workers could identify the natural grain and stress lines in a granite face and use them to guide cuts in ways that modern workers, without that accumulated experience, simply cannot replicate. This is not a dramatic explanation, but it may be a true one, and it deserves equal weight alongside the more technical possibilities. Whether the answer lies in lost knowledge or something else, the question grows considerably larger when you realize that Aswan is not the only place where these marks appear. The pattern across Egypt. If the marks at Aswan were unique to one quarry, it would be easier to treat them as a local puzzle with a local answer, the result of specific conditions, specific workers, or specific choices made at one particular site during one particular period. They are not unique. Similar groove patterns, showing the same consistent arc shapes, the same spacing regularity, and the same smooth-cut profiles have been documented at granite sites across Egypt, including at Giza, where granite was used extensively in the construction of the pyramids and their internal chambers, and at other locations where the ancient Egyptians worked with hard stone over long periods. Researchers who have compared evidence from multiple sites report that the similarities are not vague or general. The specific characteristics that made the Aswan marks difficult to explain, the arc radius consistency, the surface texture, the behavior of the cuts in confined spaces, appear at other locations in a form close enough to suggest the same underlying method was being used, not a similar method adapted independently in different places, but something that looks like a single consistent approach applied across a large geographic area over an extended period of time. That changes the nature of the question. A technique used at one quarry could reflect the ingenuity of a particular group of workers. A technique that appears consistently across hundreds of miles of territory and across different construction projects spanning generations points towards something more organized, more deliberately taught, and more deeply embedded in Egyptian stoneworking practice than a local improvisation. It also raises the question of why this consistency has not been more thoroughly documented in the mainstream archaeological record. Part of the answer is practical. Detailed surface analysis of granite marks across multiple sites requires significant resources and access, and much of the comparative work has been done relatively recently, as scanning technology and computational analysis tools have become more widely available. Part of the answer may also be that the marks were there all along, waiting for someone to look at them carefully enough and ask the right questions. The evidence from multiple sites does not settle the debate, but it does make the debate considerably harder to close with a simple answer. With evidence now spread across an entire civilization, the final question becomes the most difficult one of all. Did we underestimate the ancient Egyptians? This is where the evidence leads not to a clean conclusion, but to a question that sits at the center of how we think about ancient civilizations and what we believe they were capable of. On one side of the debate sits the archaeological evidence. Diorite hammerstones have been found at quarry sites. Ancient Egyptian texts and images show large organized workforces. The general shape of the cuts around the unfinished obelisk is consistent with percussion methods. The Egyptians had time, organization, and numbers, and those things alone can explain a great deal. On the other side sits the AI analysis and the spatial evidence. The groove profiles at Aswan and at other granite sites across Egypt match rotary cutting signatures more closely than they match hammerstone pounding. The same marks appear in confined shafts where percussion cutting would have been awkward. The consistency of the patterns across the entire country suggests a single, well-established method rather than a collection of local improvised techniques. Neither side cancels the other out. Both bodies of evidence are real. The debate is about what they mean when placed together. What Grok AI contributed to this conversation was not a verdict. It was precision, the ability to describe the marks in mathematical terms specific enough to make meaningful comparisons, and those comparisons produced results that are difficult to set aside without a detailed counter-explanation. The honest position, based on everything the evidence currently shows, is that the standard explanation covers part of what is seen at these sites, but not all of it. The parts it does not cover, the consistent grooves in confined spaces, the rotary matching profiles, the cross-site regularity, remain genuinely open questions. What that leaves us with is a choice about how to interpret uncertainty. It could mean the ancient Egyptians possessed a form of technology or tool design that has not survived in the archaeological record. It could mean they developed a level of manual skill so refined that it produced results indistinguishable from mechanical cutting. It could mean the analysis still has gaps that future research will fill. Any of those possibilities, looked at honestly, represents something worth taking seriously. The ancient Egyptians built structures that are still standing after thousands of years, in stone that resists cutting even today, using methods that remain only partially understood. That alone suggests we have not yet finished learning what they knew. The stones of Aswan are still there, and so are the marks. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.